I spent 42 years of my life knocking on doors under the scorching Phoenix, Arizona sun, believing I was saving eternal lives. I woke up at 5 a.m. to prepare my preaching territory, rehearsed presentations in front of the bathroom mirror until my voice was perfect, and smiled politely as doors were slammed in my face. I was Margaret Ann Thompson, an exemplary servant of Jehovah, a regular pioneer with 1,000 hours of preaching annually, a diligent commenter at midweek meetings, and the woman everyone in the North Phoenix congregation pointed to as a model of unshakable faith. But no one knew that behind that facade of spiritual perfection, I hid a secret that was slowly suffocating me. No one saw the tears I shed in the shower every morning, nor heard the silent screams that echoed inside my chest when I had to choose between my conscience and my community. For 4 decades, I built my entire identity around an organization that promised absolute truth, unconditional love, and divine protection. I sacrificed relationships, career opportunities, and fundamental pieces of who I truly was, all in the name of a loyalty I believed was sacred. Today, at 58 years old, I stand on the outside looking in, and the view is terrifying. The same people who embraced me in the Kingdom Hall now cross the street when they see me at the grocery store. My own sister, with whom I shared a room for 18 years, refuses my phone calls. My nephews grew up calling me an apostate, a word they don't even fully understand, but which they learned to pronounce with venom before they learned to tie their own shoes. This isn't just my exit story. It's a testimony of what happens when you dare to question the unquestionable, when you choose truth over comfort, when you finally admit that the emperor is naked even when millions insist he wears the finest clothes. It's about the brutal price of freedom, and the courage needed to start over when you're past 50. I'm about to reveal what truly happens behind the closed doors of the Kingdom Halls, far from the rehearsed smiles and the carefully edited publications. And let me warn you up front that this truth is not pretty, but it is mine, and I can finally tell it without fear. Before we dive deep into my journey, I need you to understand one fundamental thing. I was not a lukewarm or nominal Jehovah's Witness. I wasn't one of those who showed up only on Sundays to mark attendance and then went back to their normal life. My entire existence revolved around the Watchtower organization as the earth revolves around the sun. Every decision I made since I was 16 was filtered through the lens of the Watchtower publications. Every friendship, every spare minute, every leftover penny at the end of the month, everything was devoted to what I genuinely believed was the only true path to God. I grew up in a traditional Baptist family in Flagstaff, Arizona, but I found the Jehovah's Witnesses when I was just 15 through a schoolmate named Susan. She had something different, an unshakable conviction that fascinated me immediately. Her answers to life's big questions were direct, logical, seemingly Bible-based in a way my church had never been able to articulate. At 16, against my parents' furious wishes, I started studying with the Witnesses. At 18, I plunged into the cold waters of the Assembly Hall pool in Tucson and emerged as a new creation, completely devoted to Jehovah. What followed were more than 4 decades of intense service. I became a pioneer at 21, dedicating 70 hours monthly to preaching while working part-time as a receptionist to pay the bills. I married Robert, an elder 20 years my senior, at 23, not out of sweeping romantic love, but because he was spiritually strong, and I wanted a head who would guide me closer to Jehovah. Together, we formed the model couple of the congregation, the one everyone admired and that young couples tried to imitate. But as you accompany me in this narrative that will completely change your perception of this organization, I need one favor. If this story touches your heart in any way, if you recognize parts of yourself or someone you love in my words, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for vanity or numbers, but because every subscription represents a person who is willing to hear difficult truths, and every like expands the reach of this message to someone who may be desperately needing to hear it. And in the comments below, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to create a mental map of where these stories are resonating, where there are other people like me, rebuilding their lives after leaving the organization. Perhaps you're in Sao Paulo or in Lisbon, or in some small town where you feel completely alone on this journey. Leave your mark here. You are not alone, and your story matters as much as mine. My first decade as a Jehovah's Witness was characterized by a fervor that bordered on fanaticism, although at the time I called it zeal for Jehovah's house. I woke up religiously at 5:15 every morning, even in the freezing Arizona winters when darkness still completely covered the sky. My routine was timed with military precision: 15 minutes of meditation on the daily text, 30 minutes preparing my preaching territory at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed, 45 minutes getting ready with the exact type of clothing the organization considered appropriate for a servant of God. Nothing too flashy but presentable enough not to bring reproach upon Jehovah's name. Robert worked as a manager at a construction supply store, a job he kept specifically because it offered flexibility for his theocratic responsibilities. He had been an elder for 15 years when we married, a man everyone in the congregation deeply respected. His voice was always the most heard during elders' meetings, his assignments at assemblies were always the most prominent, and his counsel was sought by brothers from neighboring congregations. I felt privileged to be his wife, although our marriage was more a ministerial partnership than a romance in the traditional sense. We had no children, a decision we made consciously based on the prophetic understanding that we were living in the last days. The organization never explicitly forbade having children, but the publications often suggested that bringing children into this dying system was questionable when there was so much preaching work to be done. Robert was especially emphatic about this. He had been a witness since the 70s, had lived through the frustrated expectation of 1975 when the organization strongly insinuated that Armageddon would arrive that year, and his response to the disappointment was to double down on his commitment instead of questioning. For him, not having children was the ultimate sacrifice that demonstrated our complete confidence that the end was truly near this time. My preaching mornings followed an invariable pattern. I met my field service group at 8:30 sharp at the Kingdom Hall. Never a minute late because punctuality was a form of worship. There was always the same core of pioneers: Sister Anderson, a 72-year-old widow who had been preaching since 1968 and carried her magazines in a worn leather bag that had seen decades of service; Sister Martinez, a 40-something Mexican immigrant whose English was broken but whose faith was solid as granite; and Sister Chan, a Chinese convert who had been disowned by her Buddhist family when she was baptized, and who now found her only family in the congregation. We spent the mornings walking through the residential neighborhoods of Phoenix, under a sun that turned the asphalt into something close to liquid lava during the summer months. My ministerial bag contained copies of The Watchtower and Awake, magazines, tracts on various biblical subjects, and my territory book meticulously marked with color codes indicating not at homes, not interested, and the rare interested ones who warranted return visits. I had developed my presentation over the years until it flowed naturally, always starting with a question that aroused curiosity, smoothly transitioning to a carefully selected Bible verse, and concluding with an offer of the publications that felt more like an opportunity they couldn't miss than a sale. Most doors closed quickly, some politely, others with poorly disguised irritation, and occasionally with open hostility. I had been cursed at more times than I could count, called a cultist, a brainwasher, a member of a dangerous sect. Dogs had barked fiercely from behind metal gates. Small children had been instructed by parents to say no one was home while I clearly heard movement inside the house, and once a drunken man threw a beer in my direction that missed by inches and exploded on the sidewalk behind me. But none of this discouraged me because I had been trained to see every rejection as persecution, every closed door as further proof that we were living in the last days when people would have itching ears and would not endure sound teaching. The publications constantly assured us that we were the most hated people on earth precisely because we preached the truth, and this hatred was actually a badge of honor. Jesus had said we would be hated because of his name, and every insult, every slammed door, every look of disdain was simply a fulfillment of Bible prophecy that confirmed we were on the right path. My afternoons were dedicated to making return visits on the few people who had shown some interest, cultivating these precious contacts with the care of a gardener tending rare seedlings. I learned details about their lives, remembered the names of their children and pets, brought recipes or small gifts that showed I genuinely cared about them as people, not just as potential converts. And I truly cared. That's the part outsiders never fully understood. We weren't cynical predators manipulating innocent victims. We were true believers, absolutely convinced that we were literally saving lives, that every person we converted was someone who would survive the imminent destruction of Armageddon. When I finally managed to conduct someone to baptism, the joy I felt was indescribable. I had helped a soul escape eternal destruction. I had added one more name to the book of life. I had done something that had eternal value while everything else in this world was temporary and meaningless. These conversions became the fuel that kept me up late preparing for meetings, that pushed me out of bed on cold mornings, that sustained me through the inevitable doubts that occasionally whispered on the periphery of my consciousness but which I quickly suppressed through prayer and additional study of the organization's publications. Meetings consumed at least 3 nights of my week, each with its own specific purpose in the indoctrination program that I didn't recognize as indoctrination at the time. Tuesday nights was the Life and Ministry meeting, a 2-hour gathering where the first part focused on improving our preaching skills through rehearsed demonstrations, and the second part studied the organization's publications. Thursdays were reserved for the congregation's book study, where we spent months dissecting the latest Watchtower doctrinal publications line by line. And Sundays, of course, were the public talk followed by the Watchtower study, where a carefully written article was read paragraph by paragraph with pre-formulated questions that we were expected to answer using basically the same words from the paragraph. I loved these meetings with an intensity that I now recognize as deeply problematic. I loved the sense of belonging, of being in a hall full of people who shared my exact beliefs, who understood my peculiar language full of theocratic jargon, who validated my worldview with every comment and murmured amen. The Kingdom Hall was my sanctuary, my refuge from a world that I saw as completely corrupted by Satan and destined for imminent destruction. Inside there I was safe, I was valued, I was part of something infinitely greater than myself. Robert was particularly influential at the meetings. As an elder, he frequently conducted the Watchtower study on Sundays, and I was secretly proud of how he commanded the attention of the entire congregation. His voice was deep and authoritative, his explanations were clear and logical, and he had a way of making even the most complicated doctrines about Daniel or Revelation prophecies seem perfectly simple and obvious. Other elders often asked for his input on disciplinary matters, and he regularly served on judicial committees that dealt with disfellowshipping cases. It was through these judicial committees that I began to see the first cracks in the organization's perfect facade, although it took years for me to truly process what I was seeing. Robert would return home from these meetings late at night, often after midnight, and although he was instructed to maintain absolute confidentiality about the cases, he occasionally shared general details with me. There was the young couple who were caught in fornication, and had to sit in front of 3 middle-aged men describing in graphic detail exactly what they had physically done. There was the 17-year-old teenager who got pregnant and was disfellowshipped while the boy who impregnated her, the son of an elder, received only a private reprimand. There were cases of abuse that were handled entirely within the congregation without ever involving the authorities, based on the organization's policy of requiring 2 witnesses for any serious accusation, a rule that effectively made it impossible to prosecute abusers since abuse rarely happens in front of witnesses. Robert explained these policies as theocratic wisdom, protection against false accusations that could destroy the reputation of innocent brothers, but something inside me squirmed uncomfortably every time I heard about a child who had been abused, but whose abuser remained in the congregation because the necessary second witness was lacking. But I suppressed these concerns because I had been trained since my conversion to trust the organization, even when I didn't fully understand its decisions. The Watchtower was Jehovah's channel on earth, the only means through which God communicated with humanity in these last days. Questioning the organization was questioning Jehovah himself, and that was a thought so terrifying that I pushed it away from my mind before it could even fully form. Besides, everyone around me seemed completely comfortable with these policies, including Robert, whom I deeply respected for his spirituality. If no one else was worried, surely the problem lay in my imperfect understanding, not in the policies themselves. My social life existed exclusively within the confines of the congregation. The organization strongly discouraged close friendships with people of the world, citing 2 Corinthians about not becoming unevenly yoked with unbelievers. This meant that all my deepest friendships were with other witnesses, all the parties I attended were only with brothers and sisters, all the meaningful conversations I had revolved around theocratic topics. My parents had died years ago without ever fully reconciling with my conversion, and my younger sister Sarah, who was also Baptist, maintained a polite but cold distance from me for decades. The friendships I formed in the congregation were intense and involving, but there was always an undercurrent of conditionality that I didn't recognize at the time. We were close as long as we all remained faithful to the organization, as long as we maintained the same strict standards of behavior, as long as we never publicly questioned any teaching or policy. We saw each other multiple times a week between preaching and meetings, spent our free time together in organization-approved activities, and shared our spiritual struggles and victories with a vulnerability that created bonds that seemed unbreakable. Sister Anderson became something close to a spiritual mother to me, a woman whose faith had withstood decades of frustrated prophetic expectations, who had raised 2 children in the truth and seen them become elders in their own congregations, who seemed to have an unshakable peace that I envied and tried to cultivate in myself. Sister Martinez and I developed a friendship based on our preaching work together, spending hundreds of hours walking side by side under the Arizona sun, sharing our field experiences, laughing at the funny things that happened in service, crying together when potential converts finally rejected the message after months of Bible studies. These friendships seemed more real and deeper than anything I had experienced before becoming a witness. But there were warning signs I should have noticed, moments that revealed the fundamentally transactional nature of these relationships. When Sister Morrison, a longtime pioneer, stopped coming to meetings after her non-witness husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she needed to care for him full-time, the congregation quickly stopped talking about her except in tones of concern about her weak spirituality that caused her to put her husband above Jehovah. When Brother Phillips publicly questioned during a Watchtower study whether the disfellowshipping policy was truly loving given that Jesus ate with sinners, he was quickly called in for a meeting with the elders, and 2 weeks later it was announced that he was no longer a Jehovah's Witness, without any further explanation. Instantly he became invisible, a non-person who could not be greeted or acknowledged in any way. His wife and children remained in the congregation, but the sadness in their eyes was palpable every time I saw them at the Kingdom Hall, sitting without him, pretending he didn't exist even while they still lived under the same roof. The turn began in such a subtle way that I barely noticed it at first, like an almost imperceptible crack in a foundation that would eventually shatter the entire structure. Robert began to change during our 20th year of marriage, becoming progressively more distant, more critical, more controlling in ways that went beyond what was considered normal even within the already quite patriarchal dynamics of Jehovah's Witnesses. He had always been the head of the household in the theological sense, making the final decisions on important matters, managing our finances, determining how we would spend our free time, but this had been done with a relative gentleness that was now evaporating. I began to notice how he spoke to me differently when we were alone versus when we were in public congregation settings. In public, he was the attentive and respectful husband, always defending me when others made slightly derogatory jokes about wives, always crediting me when telling about successes in our ministry, always maintaining that facade of equal spiritual partnership. But at home, his patience grew increasingly thin, his criticisms about my preaching or preparation for meetings became harsher, and he started using verses about wife submission as weapons to shut down any discussion where I expressed an opinion different from his. There were outbursts of anger that came out of nowhere, usually over trivial things like dinner not being ready at the exact moment he arrived home or me having forgotten to iron one of his meeting shirts. He never physically hit me, but there was a kind of violence in his words, in the way he could make me feel completely worthless and spiritually inadequate with just a few carefully chosen comments. And always after these outbursts there was the repentance, the elaborate apologies about the stress of his responsibilities as an elder, about how Satan was attacking our marriage, about how he needed to work on his patience but that I also needed to be more submissive and less provocative. I tried to talk to Sister Anderson about it once, vaguely and indirectly, without revealing specific details because it would be disrespectful to my husband. Her response was exactly what the organization had conditioned me to expect, that every marriage had challenges, that my role was to be submissive and respectful regardless of how Robert treated me, that prayer and Bible study would solve any problem, and that I should be careful not to speak negatively about an elder because it could bring reproach to the congregation. She quoted 1 Peter about wives winning their husbands without a word through chaste and respectful conduct, conveniently ignoring that this verse was about Christian wives with unbelieving husbands, not about wives being mistreated by Christian leaders. It was during this period of increasing tension at home that I began to notice other problematic things in the congregation that I had previously ignored or rationalized. I realized how women were systematically excluded from any real position of authority, relegated to teaching roles only with other women or children, never allowed to speak from the stage except in carefully scripted demonstrations, always required to wear head covering if they ever had to pray in the presence of a baptized man, even if he was a teenage boy. I realized how young women who wore skirts deemed too short or tight were publicly reprimanded in local modesty talks, while men could wear well-cut suits without ever being accused of causing someone to stumble. I noticed the blatant double standard in disciplinary cases where men often received more lenient treatment than women for the same behavior, where elders' children rarely faced disfellowshipping while youth from less prominent families were expelled for minor offenses, where known abusers remained in the congregation with quiet warnings to parents not to leave their children alone with them instead of being completely removed and reported to the authorities. I saw how the organization protected its reputation above protecting the vulnerable, how the fear of lawsuits and negative publicity drove decisions more than genuine pastoral concern for the victims. The internet was starting to become more accessible in the early 2000s, and although the organization strongly discouraged researching anything about Jehovah's Witnesses online, warning that apostate websites were full of demonic lies designed to destroy our faith, my curiosity eventually overcame my inhibitions. I started cautiously, just researching factual things about the organization's history, but quickly found myself falling down a rabbit hole of information that completely contradicted what I had been taught. I discovered about the false prophecies the organization had made over the years and then quietly revised or denied, starting with 1914, then 1918, 1925, 1975, and the 1914 generation that definitely wouldn't pass away before Armageddon arrived but which had now been redefined multiple times because everyone from that generation was dead. I read about massive doctrinal changes in teachings that supposedly came directly from Jehovah, about how organ transplants were considered cannibalism and forbidden until suddenly they were a matter of conscience, about how vaccines were considered a violation of the sanctity of blood until they weren't anymore, about all the people who died refusing medical treatments that the organization now allowed. I read testimonials from other former witnesses whose stories resonated so deeply with my own experience that I cried reading them, recognizing for the first time that I was not alone in my doubts, that other people had noticed the same inconsistencies and hypocrisies that I was beginning to see. I read about the organization's involvement with the United Nations as an NGO for years, while simultaneously teaching that the UN was the wild beast of revelation. I read about the millions of dollars in lawsuits the organization was quietly paying to victims of sexual abuse, while publicly denying that there was any systemic problem. Every new piece of information I discovered was like a punch to the stomach, leaving me physically nauseous and dizzy. My first reaction was to try to rationalize and dismiss, to think that these were just lying apostates trying to destroy my faith. But much of this information came from the organization's own official documents, from old publications that I could verify, from recordings of conventions and talks, from public court documents. They weren't lies, they were verifiable facts that the organization had simply hidden or conveniently rewritten over time, trusting that loyal members would never investigate their own history. I began to have panic attacks during the meetings, feeling the walls of the Kingdom Hall closing in on me as I listened to the same conductor study the watchtower with absolute confidence, making claims that I now knew were false or misleading but that everyone around me accepted without question. I looked at the faces of the people I loved, people who had sacrificed so much for this organization, and wondered if they knew, if they would care if they knew, if they would hate me for knowing. I felt trapped in a horror movie where I was the only person who could see the monster while everyone else acted as if everything were perfectly normal. The decision to leave didn't come all at once. It wasn't a dramatic moment of revelation where I suddenly saw the light and marched out. It was a slow, agonizing process of months where every day I woke up hoping my doubts had disappeared, that I could somehow unknow what I now knew, that I could return to the comfortable certainty that had defined my entire adult life. I desperately tried to make the doubts disappear through more study of the publications, more prayer, more preaching, thinking that if I just tried harder spiritually, my faith would be restored. But knowledge cannot be unknown, and once you see the patterns of manipulation and control, you see them everywhere. I saw how convention talks use carefully calibrated emotional techniques to produce conformity, how testimonials were selected to reinforce specific narratives while stories that didn't fit perfectly were discarded, how rhetorical questions were structured so that only one answer was possible. I saw how the language in the publications gradually changed over time, subtly altering doctrines without ever explicitly admitting that previous positions were wrong, always framing changes as progressive light getting brighter instead of acknowledging fundamental errors. I saw how fear was constantly used as a tool of control, fear of Armageddon, fear of disfellowshipping, fear of losing family and friends, fear of displeasing Jehovah, fear of independent thinking that would lead to apostasy. The entire structure was designed to keep members dependent on the organization for their entire identity, their complete social circle, their understanding of reality. Leaving would mean losing everything and everyone I knew, starting completely from scratch at 54 years old without any safety net. Robert realized something was wrong when I stopped commenting at meetings, when my preaching became mechanized instead of enthusiastic, when I started making excuses to skip midweek meetings citing migraines or exhaustion. His initial reaction was pastoral concern, the elder caring for a sheep that was spiritually stumbling. He organized special Bible studies with me using the organization's publications on how to deal with doubts, encouraged me to pray more fervently, suggested that I was depressed and needed to adjust my perspective through greater theocratic involvement. But when it became clear that my doubts were not disappearing, his approach changed drastically. He started interrogating me about what exactly I was doubting, demanding to know if I had been looking at apostate material online, warning me that continuing on this path would lead to my eternal destruction and would embarrass him before the entire congregation. The discussions turned into heated arguments where he cited scripture after scripture about the importance of remaining loyal to Jehovah's organization, about how Satan was clearly attacking my mind, about how I was being selfish and ungrateful after everything the organization had given me. One night, after a particularly violent argument where I finally verbalized some of my specific concerns about abuse policies and false prophecies, Robert told me something that froze my blood. He said that if I continued expressing these doubts, he would be obligated as an elder to report me to the other elders for apostasy, and that I would be subjected to a judicial committee that would very likely result in disfellowshipping. He said this calmly, as if he were simply explaining an inevitable consequence, not threatening to destroy my entire life. In that moment, looking at the man with whom I had shared 31 years of marriage, I realized that he would choose the organization over me without hesitation. Our marriage vows, all those decades together, none of it weighed more than his loyalty to the watchtower. And I also realized that everyone in the congregation would make the same choice. Sister Anderson, whom I considered a mother, Sister Martinez, who had been my preaching partner for years, Sister Chun, who had cried on my shoulder countless times, all of them would cut me out of their lives instantly the moment it was announced that I was no longer a Jehovah's Witness. I spent weeks in an agony of indecision, weighing the cost of staying versus the cost of leaving. Staying would mean living a lie for the rest of my life, feigning beliefs I no longer held, participating in an organization that I now saw as fundamentally harmful, silently watching while other people were manipulated and controlled in the same way I had been. But leaving would mean losing literally everything, my marriage, my friendships, my complete identity, my entire community, and starting from scratch at an age when most people are thinking about retirement, not about rebuilding their lives from the beginning. The final decision came after witnessing something that broke any remaining hesitation I had. An 18-year-old girl named Emma, the daughter of Sister Rodriguez, whom I knew well, had been called in for a judicial committee for fornication after being seen hugging her non-witness boyfriend in a way someone judged inappropriate. During the committee, which included Robert, she was interrogated by 3 middle-aged men about intimate details of her sexual life, forced to describe exactly what had or had not physically happened, all under the threat of disfellowshipping if she didn't cooperate completely or if she didn't seem sufficiently repentant. Robert mentioned the case at home, not realizing how his own words horrified me. He described how Emma had cried throughout the interrogation, how she had pleaded for mercy saying that nothing sexual had actually happened beyond kissing, but that the committee decided to disfellowship her anyway because her attitude didn't demonstrate true repentance and because she refused to end the relationship with her boyfriend. He said this with approval, as if it were divine justice in action, completely unable to see anything wrong with 3 powerful men traumatizing a vulnerable teenager, and then cutting her off from her entire family and community. I saw Emma at the Kingdom Hall the following Sunday after her disfellowshipping announcement, sitting alone in the last row, completely isolated while people who had known her since she was a baby ignored her completely. I saw her mother sitting on the other side of the hall, tears silently streaming down her face, obedient to the disfellowshipping policy even as it forced her to treat her own daughter as if she didn't exist. And something inside me simply broke irreparably. I came home from that meeting and told Robert the first was leaving the organization. I didn't try to argue or explain beyond saying that I could no longer in good conscience be part of something that caused so much damage to people, especially the young and vulnerable. His reaction was even colder than I expected. He didn't beg me to reconsider or express sadness at the imminent loss of our marriage. Instead, he immediately shifted into elder mode, warning me that he would have to report my decision, that I would be disfellowshipped, that our marriage was essentially over because he couldn't remain married to an apostate without compromising his position in the congregation. Within a week, I was called in for a judicial committee. I could have simply resigned, sent a letter saying I no longer wanted to be considered a Jehovah's Witness, but part of me wanted to look these men in the eyes and speak my truth, even knowing it would be useless. I sat in that small room at the back of the Kingdom Hall before 3 elders, including Robert, and answered their questions with calm honesty about why I was leaving. I mentioned the false prophecies, the abuse policies, the double standards, the culture of fear and control. They weren't interested in considering any of my concerns. Instead, they tried to argue using the same circular logic that I had used for decades, citing Watchtower publications to prove that the Watchtower was right, insisting that I was being deceived by Satan, warning about my imminent destruction at Armageddon. When it became clear that I wouldn't change my mind, the tone shifted to something harsher. I was informed that I was being disfellowshipped for apostasy, that the announcement would be made at the next meeting, and that all members of the congregation would be required to completely shun me. Robert filed for divorce immediately after my disfellowshipping announcement. Our 3-decade marriage ended with a bureaucratic coldness that still shocks me when I think about it. He kept the house, most of our belongings, and all the friends. I took my clothes, some personal items, my relatively modest savings, and moved out to a 1-bedroom apartment across town, completely alone for the first time in my adult life. The first few months after leaving were the darkest of my life. The loneliness was overwhelming. A physical presence that suffocated me when I woke up in a silent apartment, when I ate meals alone, when I spent entire weekends without talking to another human being. My phone that used to ring constantly with sisters making preaching plans or inviting me to social gatherings now stayed silent for days on end. I tried calling Sister Anderson once, desperate just to hear a familiar voice, but she hung up the moment she realized it was me. I walked through grocery stores seeing people I had known for decades deliberately avert their eyes, cross aisles to avoid having to pass near me, treating me as if I had some fatal contagious disease. But slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. I found a therapist specializing in recovery from high-control cults, who helped me process the trauma and recognize the patterns of manipulation that I had internalized so deeply. I reached out to my sister Sarah for the first time in years, and although our relationship was damaged by decades of distance created by the organization, she welcomed me with a grace that made me weep for hours. I found online communities of former Jehovah's Witnesses where I could finally talk freely about my experience without judgment, where other people understood exactly what I was going through because they had walked through the same dark valley. Today, for years after leaving, I am rebuilding my life in ways I never imagined possible. I went back to college at 55, something the organization always discouraged as pursuing worldly goals, and I am majoring in psychology with a specialization in helping survivors of high-control groups. I have developed genuine friendships based on real mutual acceptance, not doctrinal conformity. Friendships where I can be authentically myself with all my doubts and imperfections without fear of being rejected. I have reconnected with my sister and now have a relationship with my nephews whom I barely knew before, and they tell me that the Aunt Margaret they know now is completely different from the rigid, judgmental woman who occasionally visited them years ago. I won't lie and say there is no loss, no lingering pain. I still feel a pang every time I drive past the Kingdom Hall where I spent so many thousands of hours. I still think of the women who were my closest friends and wonder if any of them ever have doubts, if any of them will eventually follow the same path as me. I still worry about people like Emma, young people whose lives are being damaged by cruel policies disguised as theocratic love. And there are moments, especially late at night when the loneliness grips me, where I catch myself questioning if I made the right choice, if it was worth losing everything for integrity and truth. But then I remember the freedom I have now, the ability to think my own thoughts without fear, to make my own choices without consulting Watchtower publications, to love people unconditionally without first needing to assess their spiritual status. I remember the genuine peace that comes from living authentically instead of playing a role written by others. And I know with a certainty that grows stronger every day, that this imperfect but honest life is infinitely more valuable than the comfortable but false illusion I left behind. They aren't who they say they are. And it took me 42 years to find the courage to admit it, but I am finally free.